Cybersecurity is a hot topic at the moment. It has always been an important topic for a lot of people to varying degrees, but right now it's on the agenda at the highest levels of government, public and private enterprise, small and medium businesses, and to some extent, even smaller family owned businesses. And the question everyone is probably asking is, are we doing this right? Have we got a strategy correct? Are we spending enough? Or are we spending nearly enough? Or are we spending too much? And if there was some way to quantitatively determine this, if we could put this on a scale of, say, 0 to 100, we would really know how we are all going because you could easily quantify and say that that government enterprise is sitting at a 75, or that small and medium business is doing well at 92, or that private enterprise is only at a 55. And once we can quantify it, we would know exactly where we are on our journey and how much more we need to do. And it would be very easy to communicate to our stakeholders. But when we can't quantify this and there's ambiguity, everyone starts getting a bit uncomfortable because then how do you really know if you're doing things right? Cybersecurity is essentially risk management, as you come to acknowledge. And risk analysis and risk management is something we have been doing for centuries. So why are we not able to do a better job with cybersecurity? One of the traditional, more well accepted ways we have always used to quantify things is based on the ROI model or the return on investment. So could we do the same with cybersecurity too? And if we could, that'd be a great benchmark for measuring, managing, and even communicating things to the board, senior management, or even shareholders. The ROI of cybersecurity, is there such a thing? My name is Prem. I'm a student of the University of California, Berkeley, my summer 2023 cohort, and this is the topic I've chosen for my Cyber 200 presentation. In our 20 minutes today, we'll start off by looking at ROI in the traditional sense. We'll set some context around it, and then we'll start to look at what ROI from a cybersecurity context and what that looks like. We'll take a look at some of the models that exist in the real world and what people use from an ROI and cybersecurity perspective, what works, what doesn't, and we'll also try to look at some facts and figures to set some real world metrics behind the whole question. And in conclusion, we'll try to answer the question that we started to ask. Is there such a thing as the ROI of cybersecurity? The topic being ROI, I'll let take a few minutes to set the context of ROI in a traditional sense. We all know how ROI or return on investment works, especially for tangible items. It's been in place for centuries and we use it in our everyday lives. I paid X dollars for this, its market value is now Y. Therefore, I readily know if I made a profit or loss on that item. Was it a worthwhile investment? And you'll have seen this used in the business sense too. Was that acquisition profitable? Did our marketing spend justify our sales volume? Now, these are very logical questions to ask, and the answers are easy, transparent, and quantifiable. Now, what happens when the item in question is not so tangible? Was it holiday worth it? I think it was, my wife doesn't. What about things like the ROI of a training program, a new software development methodology, or some HR initiatives? How do you measure ROI when things are intangible and the answer is subjective? Well, it gets a little bit more complicated and difficult, and it would require a different approach. But these are not new problems or challenges, and humans love to innovate. Now, we have come up with measurements for intangible things like human IQ scores, SCICM maturity levels, customer satisfaction index, and these are just some examples. So you'll find that there do exist frameworks and methodologies to measure the ROI of intangible initiatives too. The pyramid image you see here is a well-known framework and methodology developed by Jack Phillips of the ROI Institute and illustrates the key elements for measuring the ROI for training programs. Similarly, there exist other methods in other domains that measure ROI or net present value, which are all ways to justify or determine the efficacy of investments. And essentially, if you set a tolerance level for accuracy, then pretty much any intangible can be assigned a quantitative value. And once you do that, you can also start assigning monetary values to these. Without going into too much of the economics and financials, for the purpose of this presentation, we can keep it simple and say that if you peel off all the layers, the underlying theme is that if you're able to establish a monetary cost to or a monetary value to the cost that we have incurred, and we are similarly able to assign a monetary value to the benefits that you've derived from that investment, we can then get a cost to benefit ratio, which then gives us an ROI figure, and that can be quantified as a percentage and measure of how we have done. If we have all that knowledge and experience, and we have seen it in practice in so many other domains, let's see how we can apply it to cybersecurity. We know we need to get the ROI number, and then we need to put our monetary values on the cost and benefits that we get from cybersecurity. So let's start by looking at some of the main cost components involved. The most obvious one we know of are the hardware and software costs, and these would typically involve your firewalls, VPN, antivirus, spam filters, and anything else that you can think of. If you want to dig a bit deeper, you could look at things like the protection included with your desktop, your subscription costs, upgrade costs, and so much more. But here the disclaimer is that we are covering out some of the main ones we can think of. Another well-known cost component are the personnel costs or the HR costs specific to the cybersecurity function in your organization. And these costs tend to be more linear, as in the more staff you have, the higher your salaries, the more training you need to do for your staff, and you also need to work at the certifications and making sure they are up to speed on best practice. And I also want to talk about one other topic that's not mentioned very often, and that's organizational culture. Organizational culture and change takes time and effort, and it's a slow process. To change the culture on cybersecurity requires far more than just monthly training programs and evaluations. It is about setting the tone from the very top of the organization, and it needs to be embedded within the everyday vocabulary and communications, and it needs to be part of everyone's behavior, not just the IS department. And this investment in time and effort will then obviously translate into costs. There are also a whole host of other costs, which I've classified here under the broad heading of services, for want of a better term, and this would include everything else. Some examples being consulting with vendors, your endpoint detection and response systems, cyber insurance premiums, the costs you need to put into meeting your compliance regulations, and all the other things that you need to do to be best practice and stay on top of your cybersecurity risk in the organization. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're not looking at every little detail, but at some of the broad costs that we will incur as part of a cybersecurity function. Now that we've seen these broad categories, we can see that most of them fall under tangible overheads. And while there are intangible ones like culture and training, etc., we know from our earlier slides that these can be quantified as well. The next part of the equation is where we start to monetize the benefits we derive from having good cybersecurity in place. And this is where things become interesting. What is the benefit of having good cyber practices in place? That you don't get hacked and that you don't leak information. The absence of the event is a benefit. It's like you're almost measuring something that is negative. And typically you'll find that costs associated with the data breach also comes into the conversation here. Now, are these costs you would only incur if you didn't have good cyber practices in place? Not necessarily. You could have really good cybersecurity in place, but still incur some of these costs. Before we explore that a little bit further, let's have a look at some of these expenses first. I would like to talk about intangible expenses first. And here again, I would first like to highlight a couple of points that we don't see talked about very often when breach costs are discussed. The first one is employee morale and productivity. Now, this could have far-reaching consequences when people in the team start losing their jobs, when team members start placing blame on each other, when the morale of the whole team is affected. And it could go far beyond your IS team. Breach could potentially translate to delayed projects, missed deadlines, all of which can affect overall organizational morale for a long period. And there's plenty of research correlating employee morale and productivity. Another point I would like to talk about, and this is a change that I would like to see happening. All major companies have a corporate social responsibility, or CSR as you sometimes call it. Now they spend a lot of time and money on improving the CSR, making sure that they're using the right vendors, going green where possible, establishing equity, etc. One of the key elements of CSR is ethical responsibility. And I think it is reasonable to argue that doing the right thing by the data you hold on yourself and on behalf of your customers should be an ethical responsibility and part of the CSR benchmarks. While we see a lot of other items listed when CSR is being discussed, the security and privacy of data is never on that list. And this is a change I would like to see happening where stewardship of data is part of a company's CSR goals, which could then go on to influence their organizational culture. The impact of a breach also lends in part to reputational damage and losing out on competitive advantage, especially if there's a loss of intellectual property and such. But even if there wasn't, we know that there are costs associated with reputational damage. There is sufficient evidence to show that in the period immediately surrounding a breach, there is a negative impact on the brand and its share price. What happens though in the long term, or even say 6 to 12 months since the breach? How are these companies faring in terms of the share price? Now, here is a chart that I pulled together, which is looking at some of the biggest brand names and the data breach that they had over the last 5 to 6 years. The leftmost column shows the company name. The second column is the time when news of the fine or penalty imposed on these companies became known. And the chart shows the percentage change in share price from that time until now in 2023. And you can see that barring one company, the overwhelming trend is that share prices have continued to improve in spite of the breach news. The analysis in the previous slide is further supported by two other journal articles. Based on their research, the first paper I've got listed there from 2021 suggests that organizations may not currently face sufficient reputational risk and or direct financial consequences for a data breach, and therefore policymakers should think about ways to strengthen incentives to encourage investment in cybersecurity. An older study in 2016 confirmed similar findings. We looked at the tangible expenses related to data breaches, and although they don't seem to have long-term financial impacts, they are important to consider in our equation. Tangible expenses relating to breach are easy to quantify. These are the hard dollars affecting your bottom line. Ransom payments, legal fees and compliance fines, loss of revenue due to downtime, equipment that needs replacing. But how significant are these numbers, and are they enough of a deterrence or incentive, should I say, for companies to start investing in cyber? Looking at the same companies we looked at earlier, this chart shows some of the highest payouts between 2017 and 2022. The total amount that just these 10 companies had to pay out exceeded $5 billion. Looking at some more facts, ransom payments have been increasing, ransomware as a service increasing the number of cyber criminals and attacks. The cost of downtime is also increasing. All of these put together, it's reasonable to assume that there is sufficient deterrence here for the companies. Weighing all of this up in our cost-benefit analysis, which way will the scales tilt? What will determine that? How can we strike a balance between cost versus benefit? What usually determines this is the probability of the breach and the kind of breach that happens. And now we start talking about risk and how well we are insulated from it. What is the risk of exposure to these breaches? We know that cybersecurity is a function of risk, and we know from the previous slides why that is. Again, in a quest to quantify things, how can we measure risk, and how are we doing that currently? There are plenty of risk frameworks that help us do this. NIST, COBIT, ISO, and I would like to call it FAIR here because we'll see that again in a minute. Now, once you decide on the framework or a combination of frameworks, you would then use one of these assessment models to do your risk assessment. It could be a qualitative, a semi-quantitative, or a quantitative one. Qualitative assessment, as you can see from the table here, is quite straightforward. We map the impact and probability of an event, and the box we land on shows us our risk exposure. Easy to do, but not very pertinent for us because it doesn't quantify. Semi-quantitative assessment is a bit similar, and we can put numbers alongside our assessment of risk. This one shown here is one of the NIST tables that shows the risk options when considering threat events. Good, but we want better. And we can have that too. The FAIR framework, which stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk, can help us do this. If we identify an event, let's say the installation of a new equipment, and if we have the loss event frequency and the loss event magnitude, FAIR can even give us the probability of that risk event. As an example, if you look at the figure here, you can see in the two yellow boxes, it says that based on the input provided, there is a 55% probability of a loss greater than $100,000, but only a 10% chance that we will lose over $300,000, which is pretty impressive. And there are other models like these too, like the CSPI and earned value technique. I've picked FAIR here in today's presentation because it's a popular framework in use today. We can even go a step further. The Gordon-Lieb model even tells us how much a firm should spend on IT security. A firm's investment in IT security should not exceed 37% of the losses it expects to incur from a data breach or cyber event. And when someone makes a broad statement like that, there is a lot of discussion and scrutiny around it. And other studies have come up with slightly different numbers, especially for SMBs just starting their cybersecurity journey. The message we're getting here is that we can quantify and measure the risk elements of cybersecurity too. But what comes next? We have done the quantitative assessment and we have a number or list of probabilities and dollar values. What none of the methodologies or frameworks tells us is which of these vulnerabilities or threat or risks to fix. We still have to prioritize, and we still have to make a judgment, a subjective judgment based on where you are and what we have done and what we know, and then we still have to action them. And then once action, come back and repeat the whole cycle again. And all of this amidst a constantly changing environment where the sun is shining on Monday and a particular risk is highly unlikely, but after Patch Tuesday, we find we have a 0 day on our hands. Where is the engine that is constantly looking at these changing events, threats, landscape, and evaluating all of these risks and variables in real time? We need a very high level of automation for this to happen. And even if we did have it and calculate a perfectly accurate risk score out of 100, when something like this happens, it changes things dramatically. It'll make mathematical sense on the day when we plot it, but each day we do will be a separate number, and your risk chart for that quarter could easily end up looking like the chart shown here. How do we effectively manage and communicate cybersecurity risk in such a scenario? Cybersecurity is inherently hard, and today we have had a brief glimpse as to why. With all of the variables involved, like the ever-changing environment and landscape, software, computing power, AI, measuring the absence of an event, and all the intangibles that come with it. So we have seen that that is inherently hard. We have also seen that what adds to this is a human element. We prioritize what we want to protect. We design the defenses and strategies. We then intentionally or unintentionally breach those defenses. We are the good guys and also the bad guys. We also condone data breaches. With all of those things, we don't make it easy for ourselves. So when we take something that is already inherently complex and then add a human fallacies and complexities on top, what we ended up with is an incredibly complex and almost abstract-like problem. And while there could be such a thing as a mathematical ROI that we can calculate, it's probably not the right tool for the job. And maybe we need to look for new tools, new solutions, and ask new questions. What are those tools, solutions, or questions? That's something I shall leave with you to ponder. Thank you for watching.